Hello everyone, you're listening to The Right Side of Gaming. Today we're going to be talking about the new Gothic Lineages playtest, and what it means for D&D races going forward. Tasha's Cauldron of Everything gave us some new approaches to how Wizards of the Coast is going to be handling race in the future. They gave us these abilities for custom lineages and how to customize the existing races. And if you aren't familiar with any of that, I will link my video on it down below. Gothic Lineages gives us a little bit more info on how Wizards of the Coast is going to be handling races or lineages, both in the article itself and in their future content. Races going forward will not have a specific ability score increase attached to them, which, if you're familiar with Tasha's, they've made it where you can change the existing ones or make your own custom where you get to pick whatever you want for it. So it makes sense that they wouldn't necessarily give you a specific +2 to this, +1 to that when you can change it anyway. Likewise, it won't tell you specific languages that you gain for being a member of that race. It won't tell you that you have to be a member of a specific alignment or anything else that is purely cultural. And I'm using their words here. It's any other trait that is purely cultural. So training with weapons, tools, armor, those are things that they also consider to be cultural. I want to use the exact quote from Wizards on this next bit, just so that there's no confusion. It says in the article, quote, "Racial traits henceforth reflect only the physical or magical realities of being a player character who's a member of a particular lineage," end quote. It gives examples such as dark vision, the Dragonborn breath weapon, and the innate magical abilities for races like forest gnomes. So to be clear, they've tried to separate it out. This is what we think was sort of the cultural influence of how people perceived the typical elf, dwarf, gnome, halfling, whatever. And this is the stuff that is due to strictly their physical abilities, such as the magic abilities and things like that. Now, they also make it clear that race in D&D refers to game features used by player characters. Whenever we talk about all these races and lineages and their abilities, that's for player characters only. They state that these changes have no effect on monsters or NPCs of the same lineage or species, because monsters and NPCs don't really rely on race or class. They're just whatever they need to be, that specific stat block. And they make it clear that DMs are empowered, I'm using their word, empowered to customize their creatures. Basically, DMs should feel like they can still change things up however they need to for their NPCs and monsters, regardless of what options players have for their player characters. Now, the article also talks about some of the base stuff that each lineage in here is going to get, and I assume it's going to be the same or something similar going forward for all the other new races or lineages. It says that each of the lineages presented here gets a +2 to 1 ability score and a +1 to a second ability score, and you can't go over 20. It also notes that the lineages in here are ones that you can take at character creation, in which case it's just like normal, or you can gain them later on, and we'll see some examples of that. But if you wind up replacing your race, you'll be replacing your previous ability score increases with the new +2, +1, because for game purposes, you are a completely different race or lineage. As far as languages go, each of the races in here will know common and one other, which is pretty standard for most races and lineages so far, so I'm not surprised there, and that's probably going to be the standard going forward. It does, however, notice that if you're replacing your race or lineage with one of the options in here, it works a little bit differently from the ability score increases. Instead of changing your languages, you just retain the old languages. You don't learn any new ones. You just know what you already knew. Of course, you don't forget anything either, which is really handy because I have enough trouble speaking English as it is sometimes, it feels like. I wouldn't want to suddenly forget the language entirely. I can only imagine my characters would hate that just as much as I would. It also notes that you can have more than one creature type. Okay, so most of our characters are humanoids. And in here, we'll have options where you might be humanoid and undead, or humanoid and a construct. And it lays out the specific rules for how it works if you have two of those types. It states, and I'm going to quote, if an effect works on at least one of a creature's types, that effect can work on that creature. End quote. So, for example, if you are humanoid and undead, Cure Wounds would work on you because Cure Wounds works on humanoids even if it doesn't work on undead. So, because you have that humanoid part of you, you can be the target of Cure Wounds. Of course, I also assume that that also means because you are undead, you can be the target of Turn Undead, which will be really fun to play with, at least on the DM side of things. Now that we've got all the basics out of the way, that just sort of applies to all of them, we can go into the individual lineages themselves. And the book presents three: the Dhampir, the Hexblood, and the Reborn. And when I saw Gothic Lineages and some of these options, I immediately started thinking back to the 4E supplement. I don't know if any of you know this one, but it's the Heroes of Shadow. It's one of their player option books where you had the sort of darker, I guess, themed character options for it. Things like the Vryloka, the vampire, immediately came to mind. Revenants were also reprinted in there. They were originally a DDI, a Dungeons & Dragons Insider race. That's their online magazine at the time. And there was also some other fun options there, like necromancy and nethermancy and things like that. But I love those types of characters. Where you can have sort of your darker themes without necessarily having to be a full-on anti-hero or evil, and just being able to play up that side of things a bit. I will admit, I still own a fair amount of dark clothing. I know a lot of people that went through their punk, goth, emo phase, and still might. I went through my own in high school, and we just won't discuss that at all. But, for a lot of people like me and some of my friends, this type of thing really appeals to us on just a personal level, an aesthetic level, and just so many reasons. So I admit, I was really excited about this one, and I knew my players would be too, and I actually think this is the first thing that has popped up that I made sure to link to my players and be like, hey, you guys can do this if you want to, and I've already got one player that is looking at becoming a Hexblood, I think. But we're going to go through and talk about each of the three. So first off is the Dhampir. The Dhampir is sort of their not vampire, I guess. It can be a vampire, it can be something else. But they're between the living and the dead. And it states that their ties to the undead make them faster, gives them dark vision, and they get that life-draining bite, which is very vampire-y. So at first I kind of thought, this might scratch that Vryloka itch a bit, but I think the Vryloka were more of a race descended from beings that were vampire-like, or vampireness had sort of come into them as a race, where I think this, you can play it that way, but I think it also has the option of being that sort of like an individual thing, maybe you were human or whatever race to begin with and you got bit by a vampire. There's a couple different ways you can play it. They know a couple of, important bits for each one, for each lineage. And the first one for the Dampier is hunger. And it's one of those things where you have this sort of constant hunger as a Dampier, and you either have to sort of suppress the temptation to constantly feed, or you just give into it. But overindulging can basically make you go crazy. And I've only played a little bit of the Vampire RPG, but I remember, explaining to me, like, if you go too crazy, well, you just wind up, becoming this mindless monster forever. So you can't go around killing everything or committing horrible acts. So I think they've got a little bit of that same balance here. It's like you gotta fight against it, even if you have to or want to indulge sometimes, but too much and you go crazy. I don't think there's necessarily any game mechanics behind that, but it's a fun thing to role play, and your DMA take over a bit there. But they give a couple of different options as for what you're hungering for. It doesn't necessarily have to be blood. It can be. That's a nice common one. It's great and thematic for the vampire part. But it can also be flesh or raw meat. They talk about cerebral spinal fluid, esoteric humors. I'm going to pretend I know what that is. I should probably Google it, but I think it's just more fun to pretend. Psychic energy, that could be interesting, sort of like a mind vampire. Talk about a color from one's appearances. Dreams could be fun. The idea that you're doing sort of a dream eater thing. I have played Pokemon for way too many years, if that's the first thing that comes to mind, but, giving people nightmares. Or life energy. Of course, I read life energy and I immediately think someone's either going to play a Tiefling Dampier or just a straight up start off as a Dampier and flavor it as a succubus or incubus. And as I say that, I realize, you know what? Someone has probably already done that. I could probably Google it, and it's probably already out there on the internet. They also talk about your origins. You could go with the classic bitten by a vampire thing, but they also talk about maybe being the reincarnation of a vampire. Or maybe you've made a pact with something like a deity or a fiend, and you've sort of inherited or you share their hunger. They talk about maybe there was a vampire attack, maybe you have a parasite and it has to feed. Maybe you tried to become a vampire and it was interrupted. And that one, the example, it was kind of cute. They kind of romanticized it a little bit. It's like, maybe you were in love with an immortal and you tried to become a vampire so that you could be with them forever. And then the ritual got interrupted. I admit I am a sucker for a good love story. So that one, I kind of like that one. And you also give the example of maybe you are the diminished manifestation of an otherworldly being. And I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, oh, fun. You get to be a little chibi Thulu. And I know a lot of people that would be all over that. Just a little chibi Thulu walking around, eating people's dreams or something and giving them nightmares. And there's also the experiment and gone wrong thing, but I mean, personally, I really like the romanticized one and our little chibi Thulu or whatever. And I'm sure someone else is going to be like, well, actually, this other, Cthulhian elder god. Okay, I admit I don't know them all very well. Cthulhu is just the first one that came to mind that I really know. I'm sorry. As far as the game traits go, you are a human and you are undead. So this is where some of that two types comes into play. You can be medium or small, which is something in line with all of these. I think it's sort of ties back to Tasha's and the custom lineages. Is you can be medium or small. And this also makes sense because, you could be a halfling or a gnome that got bit instead of a human. So it makes sense. You have a 35-foot movement speed, which ties back to what they were talking about you being faster because of your undeadness. You have dark vision. You also have a climbing speed, which gets really fun because at 3rd level, you can basically walk on walls and ceilings without having to use your hands. So I like the idea of some dude just like standing on a ceiling, hanging down, if nothing else, because you kind of just have to do that at some point, and standing there and doing your sword attacks or wand attacks, or whatever it is you do. Like, is there really any benefit to it? I don't know. In a lot of situations, probably not. But it's one of those things. It's like I can do it, so I have to at some point. But that just may be me. It also gives you a vampire bite, which I think we all saw coming. It is a natural weapon. You add your constitution to attack and damage rolls. I thought that was kind of interesting. Instead of letting you pick the ability score or having it be from a couple different options, sometimes you'll see it like, choose intelligence, wisdom, or charisma. This is giving you a specific, has to be constitution. So it does push you a little bit towards a specific ability score build, even if they don't give you specific ability score increases. But it's going to be your constitution on your attack roll, and then you get to add your constitution modifier to the damage. It does 1d4 piercing damage, so it's about like a dagger. And if you are at half hit points or lower, you have advantage on the attack. And when you bite someone that isn't a construct or undead, because it's really hard to, suck the blood out of a robot or a zombie or something, you can empower the bite. Now we see this next sort of behind the mechanic thing in a couple of the races here, and it's one that I think is interesting, and maybe they'll carry forward. But you get to do this whatever special thing a number of times per day equal to your proficiency bonus, and you get it back on a long rest. So it's not necessarily once per day or a modifier thing, it's proficiency bonus. So you'll get more over time, but it's sort of this set amount. Anyway, whenever you empower your bite for however many times per day, you can either regain hit points equal to the damage dealt by the bite, or you get a bonus to your next ability check or attack roll equal to the damage dealt. So if you have, say, a +3 constitution modifier, and you're rolling your d4 piercing, that means you'll get between a +4 and +7 to an attack roll or ability check, which seems pretty good. Or you'll regain 4 to 7 hit points. And again, I'm just looking at this at like 1st level, and that's a pretty good chunk of your 1st level HP, honestly. And you can do that twice per day. And I'm thinking, that's pretty good, and it'll scale a bit. So I think that'll be a fun one to play around with. Personally, I look at the vampire and I think, okay, I think this would be really fun to play for like a stealthy class, just because I can walk on walls and ceilings, things like that. Or it might be really fun for someone that just really wants to get up in the middle of things. So you can really pump up your constitution, really make the most out of your vampire bite, and maybe even focus on that as a weapon. Maybe not necessarily exclusively, but it's something that you'd use repeatedly, so you can get up there in the middle of things, bite someone, regain some health, and really just be in the thick of it. But I'm sure there's other really fun ways to build it. Next up is the Hexblood. If the Dhampir is not quite a vampire, then the Hexblood is not quite a hag. They flavor it as maybe you used magic to grant a wish, or you entered into a bargain, and the end result was that it made you a little more hag-like. You get sort of like the forked ears, the wild skin shades, this really lengthy hair that you just cannot keep cut, and an irremovable living crown, which they call an elder cross or a witch's turn. You also get longer life, dark vision, and some magical effects with it. But they give you a couple different ways as to how maybe you became a hexblood. Maybe you made a deal with a hag and you got your wish or whatever, and this was the result. Maybe your parents made a deal with a hag and you are the result. Maybe they did the Fae child swap, or one of the Fae switched their kid out with a human baby, and vice versa. And I remember something like that in some Magic the Gathering cards, and I thought that was really cute. Yeah, like the little changeling baby. And I think they even went back and did another card where it grew up a little bit. You have maybe you were created to replace a hag in a coven, and then you get to fight against that. That'll be fun. It could be that you were cursed as a child, and you made a deal with a forest spirit, and got transformed into a hexblood, even though that got rid of the curse. Maybe you started as a fae, but then there was some crime or accident or something, and you were forced to leave your home, and that made you more haggish. You have, the option of maybe having a druid transforming you, because I guess some of them are super petty. And then it also gives the example of maybe you're just a child of the wilds. And again, all these are just examples, they're not necessarily an exclusive list, but it's the fun little tables you can roll on if you don't really know what you want to do with it. I mean, to me, I look at the Not a Vampire and the Reborn, which we'll get to later, and I get like very specific, concrete ideas, because those are things I'm used to, that I see a lot. And then something like the Hexblood and the Hags, I'm like, okay, maybe I don't know exactly what to do with that. So I like having sort of those options and seeing the list. And then even if I don't see anything on the list that maybe appeals to me, it gives me a little bit more of an idea of, well, maybe I can do something similar but a little bit different, and maybe that'll work. They also have a little aside that a Hexblood can become a full-blown hag. It can go through this little ritual and get turned into an actual hag. You say that you'd probably be, turned into an NPC unless the DM says otherwise, but you can, in theory, instead of fighting against becoming a hag, just be like, you know what? Nope, I'm out. I'm doing this. Hag me up, boys. Now, as far as the actual traits go, you are a humanoid and a fae, which is interesting. Again, you're the medium or small character, because again, start that way or turn another character that's already exists into a hexblood. You have a 30-foot movement speed, dark vision. You get some of your typical Fey-like abilities. In this case, Fey resilience. You have advantage on saving throws against charm effects, like saving throw against becoming charmed. You have advantage on ending charm effects, things like that. It also notes that you have hex magic, which lets you cast Disguise Self and Hex using your Int, Wisdom, or Charisma. You can cast one of them, not both, just one of them, either or, once per day using the trait. And then you can also use like your actual spell slots if you have them to cast them. So it's like you already like always know them and have them prepared, but you only get like one for free each day. It also gives you an ability called Magic Token, which I want to admit I am super squeamish, so it's really awkward to have to not only read this but talk about it out loud. So I'm really hoping if one of my players does pick this one up, like they were talking about, that maybe we can reflavor a little bit. But it's you can harmlessly pull out a nail, tooth, or lock of hair and imbue it with magic until you finish a long rest. And you can send messages telepathically of up to 25 words to a creature holding or carrying the token as long as you are on the same plane and within 10 miles. Also, while you're within 10 miles, you can enter a trance for a minute and see and hear from the token, and then the token is harmlessly destroyed afterwards. And you can't create the token again until after you've taken a long rest, and after you take a long rest, whatever part you removed regrows. So removing teeth and nails. No, it's squeamish. Please don't. But maybe he can make like a little living braid or something, or conjure up a little coin. Just anything other than having one of my players describe removing body parts like that every day. So that's something I would want to work with him on. Other than that, I can see how it would be fun in being able to sort of see and talk to people and hear and all that from a distance. That's always fun and good for shenanigans. Finally, we have the Reborn, which as soon as I saw it, I started thinking Revenants. I love the Revenants. In 4E, they were like these people that, I mean, they weren't necessarily human. Maybe they were before, maybe they were a different race. They sort of get reborn as a revenant, and they've got like this ashen skin and almost mask-like face. I guess there's different ways to make them, but I think the big one would be like, oh, your deity, or maybe not necessarily yours, but a deity, has reincarnated you as a revenant, and you've got this sort of deathless thing going on. And both mechanically and flavor wise for like role playing. And it was just a really interesting race. And I see that in here. This would be a great way to make a Revenant, but there's also other ways you can do it or flavor it. They say that a reborn could be someone that died. Maybe they have ashen flesh. Maybe they have missing limbs. Maybe there's scars. Maybe they have bloodless veins. It could be that they were sort of the creation of magic or science, and talks about maybe they have like different parts stitched together, and I'm starting to think that's clearly them talking about Frankenstein. I think they also gave the option of maybe having like clockwork parts if you wanted to be sort of the magic version of an android. I don't know. Maybe I just watched too much Dragon Ball Z, but that's, I guess, one way you could play it. They talk about how you have memories from before you, I guess, were reborn that are often vague or absent, and you might get sensations or visions from the past, which I think is both a fun little roleplay thing and maybe a good way to let the DM sort of tie things to the story. It's like, oh, hey, you remember this relevant thing that your character wouldn't know, but it's a good way to get things going. Also talk about how they don't really sleep, they just sort of dwell on the past, which is super edgy, and again reminds me of that high school emo phase. Again, we don't talk about that. But they might get something in a moment of peace, stress, or excitement that just sort of floods back to them. And they have this handy little lost memories table. It doesn't tell you what exactly you remember, just you roll and you get maybe this very generic category, and then you get to come up with something from it that you remember. And again, maybe you expand on it, maybe you pick something else entirely. You don't necessarily have to use these tables, but I thought, I can see how that would be really fun. Like maybe you roll a natural 20 and encounter your DM says, okay, well then you remember something. But some of the examples they gave, it's maybe you recall a physically painful moment, or a memory that causes you to shed a tear. It could be a childhood memory. It could be the memory of a voice of someone you were close to. It could be that you recall something you can't stand doing now. You might remember a vivid smell or sensation. You might remember faintly a place that you don't think could exist, or a memory that you're certain isn't your own. And I look at this and I think they had something similar both for Revenants and Deva, which were your not angel race in 4E. They were like servants of the gods rather than humans that had like some slight angelical blood in them, like ASMR. But they had that sort of recalling past lives bit, which I thought was always kind of fun and interesting. So seeing that pop up again in 5e is something that I would really love to play around with. And they talk about the origins. You could be, something that was magically resurrected, but something went wrong. It's like, hey, our party member died. You come back as a reborn instead of normally. That could be a fun way to handle character death, maybe, if the players are good with it. Could be able to stitched together and have memories from multiple lives. Looking at you, Frankenstein. In fact, I think there was an anime recently about a doctor to a bunch of monster girls that had a Frankenstein in there that suffered from that exactly. Like, because she wasn't stitched together very well, she had like all these voices, and then the doctor comes in and like stitches them all properly and gets everything under control. It was great. Could be that you crawled up out of your own grave, because we just have to have that super extra edgy thing in here for. You could be a necromancer servant who regained consciousness, which would be really fun, especially if you had a necromancer in the party. Maybe you awoke in an abandoned laboratory. I think playing up that sort of magical or scientific experiment bit. Could be you were released after being petrified for generations. Maybe your body is possessed by a spirit. Maybe you look normal but feel all like itchy on the inside, like straw. And I'm sitting here thinking, so Scarecrow? I don't know. Not entirely sure where they're going with that one. I personally like the Revenant thing, being reincarnated by a god or some other being. But I think this is another one of those where you could really get very creative with this if you really wanted to. As far as the traits go, you are human, and then your choice of either construct or undead. So depending on what type of reborn you are, did you come back as like this dead thing, or did someone kind of build you or put you together? And then again, you've got your medium or small thing, 30 feet movement, dark vision. You get a couple of fun traits. You get Deathless Nature, which is advantage on saving throws against disease and poison, and you resist poison damage. You have advantage on death saving throws. You don't need to eat, drink, or breathe, and you don't need to sleep, and magic can't put you to sleep. You only need 4 hours to finish a long rest, so you do have to be inactive and motionless, but you are conscious the whole time, so you would be a great person to just sort of stick on watch. And then we have that proficiency-based ability coming back again. In this case, it's knowledge from a past life. You temporarily remember glimpses of the past and make a skill check, but you can add a d6 to it. And you can do that a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus per long rest. And that made me think of, I think Deva in 4E had a similar ability where it's like, oh, you sort of draw upon your knowledge and skills from past lives to get a little bitty boost, which I kind of like. At any rate, I love the new lineages. I really like that they're trying to give us a little bit more freedom as to how we create and customize our characters, especially in ways that don't necessarily push you towards maybe a specific class combination for races, or at the very least, ones where you don't feel like maybe you're just at a little bit of a disadvantage just because you're picking sort of a non-optimal race class build. I'm glad they're moving away from that a little bit. And again, I just like sort of the dark Gothic flavor of a lot of this. I think I'm going to love it. I think I have players that are going to love it. And I think there's a pretty good chunk of the D&D audience, fan base, whatever you want to call it, that is just going to absolutely love this. But that's really all I had for today. I hope you enjoyed this. I would love to know if you wind up making a character based on any of this. If you wind up using any of, the Dampier, the Hexblood, or the Reborn in your games, or if you just make the character. Because some of us don't actually get to play, we just DM, and I understand that. But if you come up with a fun approach to any of these, I would love to hear it. As always, if you would like to like, subscribe, leave a comment, that's great. If you don't, that's okay too. I understand. Either way, I hope you have an awesome day, and I will catch you next time.